Hello, everyone. I wanted to talk about something that's been on my mind a little while, and that is parasocial relationships. Because a lot of people, when they talk about these, construe them as exclusively being negative things, and they bring up extreme versions of parasocial relationships that are the exception, not the rule. Now, I'm not going to sit here and say that parasocial relationships are inherently good, but I'm also not going to say they're inherently evil. Like 98% of things in life itself, parasocial relationships have their good sides and their bad sides. A lot of the examples we hear about in terms of parasocial relationships are things like Amaranth's stalker, who deluded himself into believing he was engaged to her or something along those lines and began stalking her. This is obviously insane, and this is obviously a really extreme parasocial relationship. But that is because that kind of parasocial relationship, the negative ones, the scary ones, the dangerous ones, they make news. They are what people talk about. The perfectly normal parasocial relationships that benefit the viewer and also the content creator, these are not talked about because they aren't news. As a great example, go into any video in which, as an example, Markiplier gets really heartfelt and emotional with his audience, and all in those comments you're going to find a whole range of responses, all of them positive. Some of them really talking about how they love Mark and he's been there for them in really difficult times. I'm not putting these down. These are great. This is a great positive parasocial relationship. They're there to support Mark in a very emotional time in the same way he had been there for them in their emotional times. And they've created a sort of, or at least the viewer sees him as a friend, someone they can trust, and that's fine. Based on all accounts that I've seen, and I've been following Markiplier for a long time, he's a great dude, right? Nothing wrong with that. Nor is there anything wrong with these viewers having that kind of parasocial relationship with him. I think that's great. Right? Are there going to be the occasional parasocial relationships that go to an extreme like Amaranth Stalker? Absolutely. But that's inevitable with any large group of people in any context. There's always going to be the crazy bad eggs in any batch of people. And there's nothing we can do about that, right? So there's good and bad to all things. Well, okay, not all things, but most things. But what's really particularly interesting is that a lot of people somehow believe that parasocial relationships are new, that they came in with social media. No. I'm going to provide a term, and I'm going to then drop a famous name. And if you go back and look at people's reception of these back at the height of their popularity, you'll understand what I'm driving at here. Now, the term I want to drop is Beatlemania. I'll let that one sing for a second. The name I want to drop is Elvis Presley. Okay? Now, these are really big examples. There are more, obviously. I could throw out Audrey Hepburn and her fan club as another interesting example of parasocial relationships. But if you watch videos of, taken at the time, at the height of the Beatles' popularity, at the height of Elvis's popularity, and you read articles about the Beatles or about Elvis Presley of the time, people's opinions and stuff, because this kind of thing exists. There's old videos and articles and interviews and stuff. A lot of people are saying things like, I would die for them, I love them, I want to marry them, things like that. Things we today would have called simping, right? And simping is just a bit more of an extreme parasocial relationship. It's a very specific type of parasocial relationship, really. It's someone very specifically feeling like they are in love with a content creator, usually female, but not always, as Elvis Presley and the Beatles prove, but feeling like they are in love with that content creator and kind of having their a large portion of their life revolve around it. Because do you know how easy it was for people to just obsess over the Beatles or Elvis? I had a family member who was obsessed with Elvis after the fact, right? She was young at the time and she spent years just adoring Elvis, and she had all the movies, all the books, everything. Like all the records, like the whole McCoy. And there's nothing wrong with it. It was fairly harmless. But it is a far it's a good stretch more parasocial than a lot of the examples we have today. Yes, again, we still have those crazy wild examples like Amaranth Stalker, but it was more extreme for the approximately the same group of people back in the day when they didn't even have social media. All they had to communicate their media, in this case music, or in Audrey Hepburn's case movies, was movie theaters, which applies to Audrey Hepburn and Elvis because he was an actor for a brief period of his time, radio for the music, and television for, say, Elvis's appearance on Ed Sullivan and other TV shows, right? Parasocial relationships have existed for as long as widespread media has, all right? Namely, I would say probably it became a real thing at the release of television. Well, I would say actually probably before television, movie theaters, to be honest. Um, yeah, I would probably say movie theaters. But yeah, you've got parasocial relationships absolutely existed before social media. And in fact, in a lot of ways, again, the examples I use here were like people imagining themselves in love with the target, whatever that was, and just going years being in love with them, possibly to the detriment of their own relationships and their own lives, possibly. I obviously don't know any personal examples, but it's very easy to see that it could have. And while a majority of parasocial relationships today don't get to that extreme, again, the closest thing we've got is the average simp, and we do have the occasional more extreme version, don't think for a hot minute that there weren't stalkers of actresses or actors or famous music people back in the day. There were. They had stalkers too. Same thing. The point I'm trying to make is that, very specifically, Elvis Presley and the Beatles really, in all honesty, indicate how powerful not only parasocial relationships can become and still remain borderline healthy, and I say borderline very loosely there, but also how much potential there is for businesses to come in and grab some cash out of the deal, right? Which is why you see a lot of companies nowadays trying really hard to make their the face of their individual whatever to be more relatable. I'll get into some more specific examples pretty soon, but let me throw out a more specific example, right? You know how quite a number of influencers promoted this, that, or the other crypto project or this NFT scheme or whatever, right? I'm not going to mention any specific names because that doesn't matter. There's so many influencers that have promoted some crypto coin or whatever, cryptocurrency or what have you. A lot of them have pushed this, and they are hired to push these because they are more likely to sell these due to at least some proportion of their audience feeling close enough to that content creator that they have a parasocial relationship and are more willing to believe them and buy into said project. And, you know, a lot of people, to this end, actually, to some extent, a lot of content creators kind of deliberately form parasocial relationships or do things that do accidentally form parasocial relationships. Now, what do I mean by this? You might have some specific examples in your head of a content creator saying or doing something that really caused you personally to connect with them in a way that may or may not have been intentional, but I'm going to refer back to an old trend way long ago, the Draw My Life trend, right? Everybody on YouTube was doing it. here's my childhood, and they draw that, and then here's, this, that, and the other thing. Now, the fact that this was a huge trend makes it difficult to say by individual whether or not it was intended to form a deeper connection with their audience, but at least the first couple were very likely intended by the content creator to form that deeper connection with their audience that does then evolve into a parasocial relationship. And I don't know who was the first one to bust out a Draw My Life video. I have no idea. I just remember seeing a whole bunch of these across the board. Hell, even Game Theory did one, right, with MatPat. And, whether it was to follow the trend or deliberately to create parasocial or form more parasocial relationships with their audiences, the Draw My Life thing did absolutely that. It created a backstory of the content creator that audiences had the potential to sympathize with, to maybe have some overlap with, because while not everyone is going to have the same kind of childhood, there are going to be some commonalities amongst certain people of certain groups, right? And as a result, people who share some of these commonalities with that backstory of the content creator are going to feel more like that content creator is similar to them, and that means that they would be friends in real life, and then it just kind of evolves from there, right? And again, there's nothing necessarily inherently wrong with this, unless you are talking about it developing to the more extreme versions like stalking, or a content creator taking advantage of that parasocial relationship to in some way harm their audience or specific members of the audience. Also happens. Generally speaking, it works out just fine. Now, again, it is fairly important for a brand to become, or at least encourage, a certain amount of parasocial relationships, because that can really help boost the loyalty of an audience, as well as to help a person sort of sell certain things, right? Again, I'm going to bring up the crypto stuff here. Those influencers were... Now, all kinds of influencers were contacted by various crypto projects over the past few years, but content creators weren't selling their audience. They were essentially selling the members of the audience that had that parasocial relationship with them, that they would be willing to buy literally nothing just because their favorite content creator said so, right? And in fact, if an individual is deeply unrelatable, that can have some very serious consequences for their career. And I'm not just talking about social media here. I'm going to bust out a couple of examples. The Miss Marvel movie, which stars Brie Larson, that movie was not the best received initially. It had sort of mixed reviews, right? And in response to the more critical portions of the audience, a lot of things were said by the studio and also by Brie Larson that really made it sound like the movie was not intended for guys. It was a woman's movie, and if you're a guy, you shouldn't watch it, right? So I didn't watch it because I did not get the feeling that I would be able to relate at all to it, which would, of course, naturally really break my ability to immerse myself in the film, right? This isn't the only example. It's the more recent of several that I can think of, but there was absolutely this sort of message broadcast out there that turned away people like me who didn't care either way. They probably would have seen it out of curiosity, and then, a whole bunch of vitriol came out, and it was basically stated that if you're a guy, particularly a white guy, which, I don't know, sounds kind of racist to me, but anyways, if you're a guy, you're not gonna care for this movie because it's not about guys. Yeah, the Alien movie wasn't about guys, and yet it's one of my favorite horror films of all times, and in fact has one of my favorite protagonists of all time. Okay? Ripley is an incredibly strong character that anybody can sympathize with, because her situation is completely separate from any sort of identifiers, right? Anybody could be in that situation and they could react the same as Ripley, and it would be identifiable with the audience. Ripley is stuck on a ship with a dangerous alien. Cue immediate sympathy, because Ripley's responses throughout that film are what a lot of people watching would do in that situation. Guy or girl, does not matter. Same exact thing with the original Halloween, with Laurie. Her reactions are really understandable, really human, regardless of whether you are a man or a woman. Again, another one of my favorite protagonists that I've seen in a film. Okay? More than even some of the bigger name protagonists I've seen, I identify more with Laurie and Ripley than I do with, say, Indiana Jones or Luke Skywalker. Indiana Jones, because a lot of his characterization does come from a basis of knowing what the hell is going on in terms of the historical background of this stuff. Something I don't have. I mean, I love knowledge and I love history. And obviously some of that stuff was invented for the sake of the film, but he's got a very specific archaeological background. While in some ways I can empathize and sympathize with him, and I can see qualities of him that I either possess or alternatively wish I possessed, right? I still don't identify with him nearly as much as I do with Laurie or Ripley, who are just regular people like me, stuck in a really intense, sudden situation. Alright? I would never accidentally find myself in the situation Indiana Jones is in. Indiana Jones is put into those positions because of his knowledge and experience in that sphere. Ripley did not have any experience with the alien before it just showed up on the ship and started killing people, right? Or I should say was brought onto the ship, being a better description. But anyways, she wasn't in that situation due to some specific set of skills or knowledge that she had. She just muddled through the best she could with what she had. Right? Same thing with Laurie. She's stalked by Michael Myers and responds and reacts to the best of her ability. She was chosen because she was distantly related to him, but the idea of having a stalker can happen to anyone, and her responses to that, given the fact that it just happened to be a particularly dangerous stalker. I mean, all stalkers have the potential to be dangerous, but Michael Myers was obviously a particularly dangerous one, thus horror movie. But anyways, her responses and her reactions and her, decisions throughout the film are what a lot of people would expect to fulfill, right? And these are all three of these characters are in that position with having nothing to do with them being a man or a woman. Indiana Jones is only a guy because that's how the writers either personally identified. The writers were either guys, and so they created a guy, which is understandable and natural, right? You write what you know. But you could very easily, if you went back and rewrote history and you switched the gender of Indiana Jones to a woman, that wouldn't intrinsically change the film. It wouldn't change why Indy was there. Man or woman, Indiana Jones was there due to the skills and the knowledge that the situation demanded. As an example, again, maybe you disagree, but if you disagree, is that because you're so used to Indiana Jones being a guy that switching that to a woman doesn't work? You're just too used to it, which is fair. Again, that's something we can't control psychologically, but it's understandable. But if you actually get down to how Indiana Jones got into that situation, it has nothing to do with Indiana Jones being a guy. It has everything to do with his skills and experience. Make Indiana Jones a woman, the plot does not change. At all. So, to just claim that just being a different gender or identifying as a different gender from the main character is all it takes to break relatability is absolute nonsense, right? And yet, due to this claim and the very aggressive way in which basically me and the public in general was told, yeah, if you're a white guy, don't watch this film, you're not going to like it because it has nothing to do with you. Well, very true, but then that gives me the impression that this film was deliberately written in such a way that it's only relatable to women, which, that's fine. But as a guy, I'm not going to want to watch that, right? Again, some of my favorite films have female protagonists, and I identify with them a lot more than I identify with 98% of male protagonists. And that is because the situations they're in have nothing to do with the fact that they're women. Okay? And you could very easily have done the same thing with Miss Marvel. In fact, that might actually be the case of Miss Marvel. I haven't seen the film because of the messaging and the response from the studio and from Brie Larson. But at the end of the day, maybe that's very true of Miss Marvel. One day I'll watch it and find out, but I'm kind of busy at the moment with my life. But, when I have some free time, maybe I'll go and watch that and find out for myself. But it's just not high on my list of things to see. And the same thing could be said for even things outside of a media context. Consider the Amber Heard versus Johnny Depp trial. While people tended to be on Johnny Depp's side initially from the get-go because, honestly, just he hadn't been talking about the whole thing, and she'd been spending years talking about it, and people were, well, I'm not going to get into the backstory. I'm just going to get right to the brass tacks here. A lot of the reason why public opinion turned against Amber Heard is because Johnny Depp was very relatable throughout the trial. He reacted very humanly to everything that went on in the trial. He was making jokes that a lot of people would have made in the same situation. He was laughing at the same time we were laughing, etc. And then you bring Amber Heard on screen, and she is so unrelatable. Her reactions, her responses are measured out and presented in a very different way than Johnny Depp. Johnny Depp is just there and kind of chilling. Or at least that's the way he is perceived. I personally see it that way. And she comes out and she's, her dog stepped on a bee, right? That famous meme. That was just one example. It's the most egregious example, but it's a really clean example as to specifically how unrelatable she was compared to Johnny Depp. Right? So, a lot of that court of public opinion just couldn't relate to her, but they related very easily to Johnny Depp. And thus, in the public's eyes, as well as apparently in the eyes of the law, Johnny Depp won. And the result of this, incidentally, is that people are trying to boycott Amber Heard out of various projects. It's going to have a very serious effect on her career, because people aren't going to want to watch her. And you might be thinking to yourself, well, she'll get work. Yeah, maybe. But her presence in a film is going to be seen as a negative. Even back in the 1900s, throughout that whole century, even when there were fewer things to watch, right? Even when there were fewer things to do in terms of hobbies for most people, you still had people willing and able to boycott films based on the inclusion of specific actors or actresses, to the point where a term was created, box office poison, to describe particularly unpopular actors or actresses in the eyes of the public. The public wouldn't go to see their movies because they'd done something and the public was upset at them. Nowadays, it's even more difficult to recover if the public turns against you, because there's even more things that the audience can choose to pursue other than your thing, right? Let's take an example. Let's take Aquaman 2. Let's say Amber Heard shows up as a major significant portion of Aquaman 2. I don't know what their actual plans are for that, but let's just create a hypothetical. A lot of people will not see Aquaman 2 because she is in it. They will go and watch some other movie, or they'll binge watch some TV show, or they'll read a book, or they'll play one of thousands of games. Again, there's thousands of television shows now, thousands of movies that they can watch on Netflix or Hulu, TV shows with the same kind of access. There's so many different other things that a person can actively choose to watch instead of a movie with Amber Heard in it, that this huge reputational hit to her image, to the perception of her from the public, is going to have some very long-lasting consequences for her career, right? So it is important, and that is why companies are looking to try to become more relatable. We've got the strange or relatable ads, right, where advertisements are trying very hard to be relatable for the audience. This is why a lot of shows live or die by how relatable the protagonist is. This is why a lot of media nowadays is really pushing forth personal interviews with a lot of the bigger leads of their shows. For example, Stranger Things. The cast of Stranger Things, and I don't have a problem with this, but I'm going to get into why I'm mentioning this in the first place. The cast of Stranger Things, and also of the more recent Wednesday show on Netflix, both of these had a huge amount of interviews, whereas, say, even a decade ago, there would be interviews, sure, but there wouldn't be as many interviews with as many of the people in the show. Nowadays, they get like this huge... I think the first time this was really done was for the Harry Potter franchise, where they got, the multiple, major characters of the series gathered around for a whole bunch of interviews and stuff like that. And then they kind of rinsed and repeated for the Hunger Games. So, the multi-movie film franchises would do this, and the Marvel series did this as well, but now we're starting to see this crop up very extensively with, the bigger TV shows. Well, I say TV shows, the bigger Netflix shows, the bigger Hulu shows. They have like half the major cast of Wednesday in interviews, interacting and talking, and the same thing for Stranger Things. And again, I don't necessarily have any particular problem with this, but the goal from the company perspective is to try to create a parasocial connection between the audience and the people in the show, the actors and actresses playing the characters in the show. That is what they're trying to do. So that way you can then go in and maybe find other things they've been in. For example, Jenna Ortega. I have seen a whole lot more clips of other things she's been in after the success of Wednesday and all these interviews than I've ever seen before. Right? There's a whole bunch of shows I didn't even know existed, but now I'm seeing clips of on TikTok and even on YouTube in compilations being recommended to me that, hey, she's in this, right? Now, I like the Wednesday show. It's a good show. Obviously, like all things, it has flaws, but it's a good show. I like Stranger Things, so I'm aware of exactly what's going on, but that is specifically what they're aiming for, and it's working in this particular case. It worked with certain members of Stranger Things, where some people did create parasocial relationships through the interviews, and you might think that this is a bit extreme, but I've actually seen a couple of comments specifically regarding Finn, where a bunch of people watched some movie. I, for the life of me, can't remember the title of the movie, but they went out and watched this movie just because he was in it. And that's not a new concept. There have been people watching specific movies because their favorite actor or actress is in it forever, right? That's been a thing since the dawn of movies. But these interviews can achieve that similar effect. Right? So, and the interviews are more actually effective than the shows themselves, because in the show we understand that that is a character that's not actually how the person is. At least most people understand that. Some people on Twitter don't really get that, but Twitter's a whole separate reality. Back to the point, these interviews are theoretically, and probably primarily are actually the actors and actresses speaking their mind and talking, as themselves, thus creating a more direct link to who they are as people, and thereby being able to create a whole series of parasocial relationships. I mean, Millie Bobby Brown is another good example of a whole bunch of people creating a parasocial relationship with her in what I think is a very unhealthy way. In her case, there's been a lot of weird stuff regarding her. I'm not blaming her. That's not her fault. I feel bad for her. But as another example from, again, Stranger Things. And, that's really the theoretic threat of content creators, is they are, in theory, just people like you or me just busting out videos on the internet, right? That's kind of what I do. I just sit down, I bust out some videos, right? So as a result, an audience member is more likely to form that parasocial relationship with that content creator as opposed to someone in a show or a movie. Again, it's still possible for someone to form a parasocial relationship with an actor or an actress even when they are playing a role. Again, that was a rather big thing in the 1900s. But at the end of the day, it's even easier for this to form under the auspice of theoretically that person being, real on a video. And I think what we really should be talking about in terms of parasocial relationships is how do we help out people who have a parasocial relationship with a negative or a dangerous individual. I'm going to throw out some examples here. Andrew Tate and Sneeko, they have a fairly substantial audience, and a lot of that audience see them as heroes or as role models or as some kind of idol. And because this is something that they have come to the conclusion of via internet connectivity through their content, that is a form of parasocial relationship. They feel like these people are good enough that they aspire to be them or like them, right? And these people, among others, are spreading some very dangerous ideas, some very unsafe ideas. And while we can arrest or ban them as much as we want, it's not going to change the people who do have that parasocial relationship, the people who see these people as more than just content creators in some ways. And we're not talking about how do we help deprogram these people in a similar way as one would deprogram a cultist, because it's kind of what they're forming over there in the manosphere space, is a sort of pseudo-cult, right? Not just around Andrew Tate and Sneeko, but in the manosphere content area in general, and it's a matter of time before the same thing happens in the womanosphere. In fact, I think it already is happening in the womanosphere, which, is equally dangerous. How do we take people with that parasocial relationship with these more dangerous individuals? How do we pull them away from that? We talk at great length about the exceptions, the scary exceptions that make headlines and draw views and pull eyeballs. We don't talk about the things that happen just under the surface. We don't talk about the people with a parasocial relationship with someone dangerous. We don't talk about the good parasocial relationships that are helping people. We don't talk about any of those. And you might be, in your head, you might be thinking mainstream news is guilty of this, but yeah, that they're guilty of this, sure. But just as guilty are the content creators who cover parasocial relationships, but they only cover these specific examples. Yes, absolutely. These are standout dangerous examples of extreme parasocial relationships, and we absolutely should have a conversation about these. I'm not denying that. But we should also be looking at the entire subject matter of parasocial relationships, and we are not. We are focusing only on the most sensational examples. Whether you're a YouTube content creator talking about it or a major news source talking about it, both sides are equally guilty of doing this. We're not talking about the rest of it. We're not talking about the full picture. And until we look at the full picture and fully and better understand parasocial relationships, both the good and the bad and the ugly, we aren't going to make any headway, right? So, just kind of throwing that thought out there, that we're not having enough conversations about this, and these conversations, the conversations we are having, are entirely focused around the exceptional, scary ones that draw eyeballs. Let's go a bit boring. Let's talk about the good ones. Let's talk about the ones sucked into a pseudo cult embracing some very negative ideas. How do we help these people? Right? But that's where I'm going to leave that for the moment. Thank you very much for listening. Have a great day.